Okay, hello and welcome, everyone, over here in the room with me and online. I'm really happy that you had time to join us today in the morning of a Friday. Okay, today we have a fascinating talk delivered by a fascinating guest, Jaime Harrison. And the talk will be, as you can see already in the slides, about literature and digital culture. Jaime Harrison is an associate lecturer and tutor at Queen's University Belfast and Ulster University, teaching contemporary and American literature and culture and coaching students in academic writing. His monograph, Digital Culture in Contemporary Fiction, offers the first analysis of computational algorithms in contemporary fiction. His research has also appeared in Textual Practice. And I have to say that no, I am just reading Jamie's book, and I find it very interesting. I think it's a perfect book for anyone who is into digital culture and literature. Jamie, I'm really happy to have you with us today. I hope everything is okay on your end.
Yep, everything's good. Everything's good.
Okay, so Jamie, the floor is all yours now, and we are looking forward to hearing your talk now.
Okay, thank you, Bart. And thank you everyone for, joining me today. 10 a.m. on a Friday is a tough time to get people to show up. So I do appreciate so many people being there. And yeah, today, as Bart says, a lot of this kind of drawing on the work I did for my monograph. And I suppose in putting together this talk, I was really just thinking about trying to give you a bit of an introduction to that monograph, give you an idea about what that project was about, give you a bit of background on some of those texts that I identified that were really engaging with digital culture and engaging with digital culture in a slightly deeper level than a lot of other literary works were. Really, the type of texts I was looking for were texts that were taking digital culture as their main subject, and really trying to get into what the issues around digital culture are, trying to actually zone in and consider the algorithms themselves, consider the technology itself, and how that is perhaps shaping our culture, how that is perhaps shaping subjectivity, how individuals are responding to that digital culture. So I'm going to give you a bit of a brief background on what that project is, give you a bit of an overview on the type of text that I was looking at. And then I want to go in and kind of just describe one of those texts in particular. I'll be looking at Neil Stephenson's Dodge or Fall in Hell. Um, Obviously, I'm not expecting anyone to really have read that text at this point, so I'll keep it quite broad in my approach to how I describe it, and really look at who Stevenson was as a figure or is as a figure, and his interest in digital culture. So. Um, I just okay, good. Slides are working. Right. So I'm starting with this is an issue from McSweeney's Quarterly Concern, which is a journal that was put together primarily to publish fiction. And it was put together to publish fiction that had been rejected um, other um, by other journals at the time, but it's since grown significantly, and it's published many key authors, of the contemporary moment. And this is issue 54. It was published in November 2018, and it was subtitled "The End of Trust." And it was something of a departure for the journal, which was established in 1998 to publish fiction, rather than the usual mix of fiction and essays that characterize the journal. It was produced in conjunction with the Electronic Frontier Foundation and comprised entirely of nonfiction, bringing together essays and debates to provide, quote, an investigation of surveillance in the digital age. Contributions covered a wide range of topics concerning how the introduction of algorithmic tools to structures of governments and commerce were reshaping American life. In a Q&A with Alvaro Bedoya, the AFF's executive director, Cindy Cohn explains that part of the reason why they decided to have the conversation in McSweeney's was to try to reach out to the artists, writers of their culture more broadly. So one of Cohn's aspirations for the collection then was to move general concerns about digital culture, and more specifically privacy and digital surveillance, from the realm of digital rights groups, such as the EFF, into the wider culture. And in this, there's a gesture towards digital culture, or sorry, there's a gesture towards culture and cultural products as spaces to contest structures of power. These products can challenge the structures that shape human life by defining them and opening them up for debate. So in this talk, I want to consider how this cultural moment is to a certain extent and has already been underway by highlighting a growing body of literary works that explore and contest the ways in which digital culture is reshaping the subject and subjective experience. I'm using digital culture here to refer to the multivariate ways that contemporary technology is reshaping society and culture. Within its remit are questions of how the subject is reshaped by growing ubiquity of computers and computational practices, a pervasive interconnectedness between subjects, and their access to unprecedented floods of data. William Davis, professor in political economy at Goldsmiths, University of London, describes how in the contemporary moment we are constantly leaving a trail of data wherever we go. The reach of contemporary digital culture is such that participation is unconditional, regardless of the extent of the subject's interaction with technology itself, making it hard to imagine a return to a pre-digital self. On a fundamental level, the texts I've identified seek to interrogate the overarching question of what it means to be human in the digital age. Much like the algorithmic processes they critique, they operate on both micro and macro scales to reveal the multivariate technical, social, political, and economic systems which contribute to digital culture's manipulative functions. As such, they have the ability to impart knowledge to the reader with respect to the ways in which digital culture intersects with and collides against other social systems. Defining and revealing the reach of digital culture on a novelistic canvas is the first step towards pushing back against how it impacts our lives. By revealing that the systems of digital culture are constructed, the text gesture towards how these systems can be reconstructed. But at the same time, they encourage the reader to reflect back on the limitations of resistance. In revealing these structures, they often gesture towards the difficulties of reconstructing or reforming them. And it's worth noting at this point that there are two primary characteristics of contemporary technology upon which public debate often centers, each of which is exemplified by perhaps the two most significant tech-related events in the last 15 years. The first of these is how ubiquitous computers and digital platforms surveil the subject, a facet central to the Snowden revelations. And the second is how digital platforms have the potential to herd subjects en masse, central to the revelations of Cambridge Analytica's involvement in manipulating the Brexit vote and the 2016 US presidential election. As cultural products that seek to engage with the underlying structures of digital culture, many literary texts have taken to interrogate the semantic structure of the algorithms themselves. Okay, so in autumn 2013, these two novels were published. These two novels, which were attempting to interrogate the then contemporary digital culture. So we have Thomas Pynchon's Bleeding Edge and Dave Eggers' The Circle. Although they were certainly composed prior to the publication of the Snowden revelations 3 months earlier, reviewers noted how the novels spoke to concerns which had come to the forefront of public debate during that period. For example, Nathaniel Rich's review of Bleeding Edge for The Atlantic hailed it as the Thomas Pynchon novel for the Edward Snowden era, while Lionel Shriver's review of The Circle for the Financial Times emphasized a resonance with current affairs, Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks. Bleeding Edge is set in 2001 and 2002 and depicts a tech industry struggling with the burst of the dot-com bubble. Through this, Pynchon charts an erosion of online privacy, which is exacerbated by increased securitization following the September 11 attacks, until the protagonist Maxine finds herself in a time when, quote, some all-knowing cyber yenta would be logging her every click, her every cursor movement, knowing what she wants before she does. Through this, Bleeding Edge attempts to contextualize many of the privacy concerns that Snowden's revelations opened up. And Egger's The Circle offers a similar critique, but with a focus on corporate culture rather than national security. The Circle centers on a massive tech company, also called The Circle, whose true use social media platform is an amalgam of Google, Facebook, and Twitter, companies that have all been purchased and subsumed by The Circle. The Circle espouses both its employees and the public an ideology in which all data should be open for acquisition. To this end, Orwellian slogans are ingrained in their culture. And these overt allusions to 1984 are characteristic of a direct and often crude criticism of digital culture. The Circle presents a company aspiring towards a tyrannic monopoly, determined to become the backbone of governmental infrastructure, led by cartoonishly evil executives, one of whom literally owns a shark to emphasize his sharkiness. These elements constantly and unsubtly frame digital culture in a negative light, which is often to the novel's detriment, but also make The Circle an example par excellence of a literary text attempting to engage with emerging debates. The novel's been picked apart by many scholars, such as Brian Jarvis, who offers a reading of it and its subsequent film adaptation within a surveillance studies framework. So both these novels show an effort to make sense of how our lives are being reshaped by digital culture. Since their publication, there has been a rapidly expanding corpus of texts with a similar focus, including Jonathan Franzen's Purity, which critiques the utopian ideology and surveillance capability of digital technology through a hacktivist organization called the Sunlight Project. There's also Matthew Debatio's Seizure Trilogy, Nick Harkaway's Gnomon, Tim Maughan's Infinite Detail, and Joanna Kavanagh's Zed, each of which present dystopian visions of a United Kingdom under constant digital surveillance. Adam Levin's Bubblegum tackles the concerns of digital culture through a society in which the internet never existed, and in which flesh-based robots called curios exist as the dominant technology in its place. Despite the diversity of approach to their subject, these texts represent new writing that is attentive to how digital culture is reshaping subjectivity. And my own monograph considers three such novels: Joshua Cohen's Book of Numbers, Nicola Barker's HAPPY, and Neil Stephenson's Fall or Dodge in Hell, and one visual novel, Grasshopper Manufactures, The 25th Ward, The Silver Case. More recent examples include Patricia Lockwood's No One Is Talking About This, and Kai-Fu Lee and Chen Kui Fan's AI 2041. These texts are temporally located in a moment of digital culture, which is distinguished from earlier digital cultures and how it is characterized by an unprecedented scale of data accumulation and analysis. This moment is best understood as gradually building from 1998 until 2013, when the Snowden revelations brought the reach of contemporary digital culture to the forefront of public consciousness. In identifying these texts as responding to a particular cultural moment, I'm drawing a distinction between the present moment and earlier phases in the history of computing, such as the advent of the microprocessor in the 1960s, the mass computerization of workplaces in the 1970s and 80s, and the growing ubiquity of home desktop computing and internet access beginning in the 90s. While many continuities remain, in particular the logic that underlies digital systems and the intensification of information flows enabled by networks, the current phase represents a much more fundamental shift characterized by the emergence of a new ethos of software development with more profound consequences for subjectivity. Nick Seaver, an anthropologist who has conceptualized algorithms, describes the emergence of a mind-oriented approach to software design that has become broadly influential across the industry. This has resulted in the rapid growth of behavioral approaches as corporations treat users not as customers choosing among various commodities, but as instinctual minds susceptible to subtle outside influences. Following on from Seaver, I considered the turn to behaviorist models in software development, coupled with and fueled by an abundance of behavioral data as a distinct phase in the history of computing. As the genesis point of this phase, 1998 is significant as it witnessed the establishment of two projects alert to technology's persuasive potential. The first of these in the corporate sphere is the incorporation of Google by Larry Page and Sergey Brin in September, a company that would become synonymous with harvesting and utilizing behavioral data. The second in the academic sphere is the foundation of the Persuasive Technology Lab at Stanford by B.J. Fogg. Fogg's lab was established to study computers as persuasive technologies and subsequently employ technology to design for behavior change. Subsequent developments in behaviorist approaches to data include the establishment of the Customer Behavior Research Unit at Amazon under David Selinger in January 2003, with the task of building a customer-based data set and then proving they were opportunities, kind of fissures of gold. For many scholars, such as Antoinette Roy, who criticizes algorithms for speaking for us, this new digital culture poses a threat to the subject's ability to self-actualize. Okay, so that's just a bit of the background, kind of the theoretical background to which I'm approaching these texts. I'm going to move on then to consider one of the specific texts which engages with our contemporary moment. I'll give a brief overview of it. I'll give a brief overview on the author Neil Stevenson and his long-term interest in digital culture. And then I'll focus in on how in the later sections of that novel, Stevenson thematizes one type of algorithm which is significant in shaping our contemporary moment, how he thematizes machine learning. So there's Stevenson there, and there's a pile of his books. So Stevenson was born in 1959, and he's the author of a significant body of work of speculative fiction including for him science fiction, cyberpunk, and historical fiction. His 2019 speculative novel, Fall or Dodge in Hell, continues a long-running contemplation of the systems of theoretical computer science, which dominates much of his oeuvre, beginning with Snow Crash in 1992. Snow Crash being a dystopian novel which depicted subjects living between the physical world and an interconnected virtual space called the metaverse, in many ways anticipating the modern internet. This interest in digital culture intensified with Cryptonomicon, published in 1999, which in its two parallel narratives traces the techniques of encryption and decryption developed at Bletchley Park to modern cryptography. And it serves as somewhat of a formal turning point in the author's career, initiating a series of encyclopedic tomes which resemble the erudite excessive system novels identified by literary scholar Tom LeClaire. Stevenson's historical Baroque cycle trilogy, published between 2003 and 2004, traces these concepts further to the foundations of mathematics, money, and modern philosophy, while Rinde, published in 2011, depicts massively multiplayer online role-playing games, gold farming, and social networking platforms which are exploited by Islamic terrorists and Russian criminal organizations. As a novelist who shares an interest in digital with the authors I've mentioned above, Stevenson is distinct in several ways. On the one hand, he is more of a hands-on experience with the technology he critiques, while on the other, his work has been cited by many figures in the software industry as directly influencing the trajectory of their technology. Between 1999 and 2006, Stevenson moonlighted at Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin, the privately funded aerospace manufacturer, where he described his role as performing operations as prosaic as punching down Ethernet cables, operating a plate grinder, and passivating rocket parts. But the bulk of his efforts were devoted to investigating possible alternatives to conventional rockets as ways of getting into space. This hands-on approach has continued into a further role as chief futurist for startup Magic Leap, which sought to develop retinal display technology for augmented reality applications. Stevenson's engagement with technology critiques in his fiction suggests a different perspective from many authors who appear to maintain a distance from technology. And thus, he brings to his writing a working knowledge of emerging technology, which finds its way into his fiction, which he then repackages for a wider audience. So, Stevenson's access to positions within several tech companies largely comes from the reverence which his work, Snow Crash in particular, holds among many Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. Snow Crash has been called prescient in how it predicts many facets of the contemporary internet, such as a global network which can be accessed through fiber optic cables and wireless connections, the digitization of physical media, and the aggressive protection of intellectual property through systems similar to digital rights management. But in Snow Crash's case, the line is muddied between prescience and influence, as the novel has been acknowledged as a source of inspiration by many key figures in the tech industry. Nicholas Lemon's profile on LinkedIn founder Reid Hoffman notes that the entrepreneur was entranced by the novel. Co-founder of Google, Sergey Brin, lists it as one of his favorite books and calls it 10 years ahead of its time. Avi Barziv claims the novel's Earth app, a program which provides satellite images of the planet, including Street View style ground level exploration, was the inspiration for Earth Viewer, the application which would eventually become Google Earth. And the term metaverse has obviously been adopted by meta platforms, with the company claiming it better communicates their expanded business plan. In speaking to many key figures in the tech industry, Snow Crash thus exemplifies the potential for fiction to shape technology, or at least to inspire it. So brings us on to the text. When I focus on Fall or Dodge in Hell. So in picking up the thread of digital technology from Stevenson's earlier work, Fall offers a critique which calls for a corrective to how this technology has evolved in the interim. The opening and closing chapters of the novel begin with the same line, Dodge became conscious. The repetition might suggest continuity, but the novel's conceit questions the notion that these two instances refer to the same action. Fall centers on video game developer Richard Daw Forthrest, who dies during a routine medical procedure in the opening chapter, and whose connectome, a map of the neural connections of the brain, is subsequently digitized and uploaded to a virtual world of his own creation, thus interrogating the very nature of consciousness itself. Through this, Fall offers a critique of how contemporary digital culture is capable of shaping what the subject is conscious of, depicting how technology creates an intoxicating array of signs and signifiers with the power to disrupt consciousness and subjectivity, what we may call an online dream world. As the novel progresses, its action increasingly alternates between the real world, meat space, and the virtual one created by Dodge called Bitworld. And this throws into relief how our augmented reality can codify patterns and behaviors in much the same way a virtual one can, and transform consciousness in the process. Central to Stevenson's critique are two aspects of digital culture. First, he critiques the ubiquity of technology, which mediates the internet. And second, he looks at how the contemporary internet propagates misinformation and subsequently creates a pervasive doubt of expert knowledge. A quarter of the way through the novel, a character reminisces about a time when people agreed on facts. And in doing so, he points to fracturing of what is understood to constitute truth, speaking directly to the condition is known as a post-truth, in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. The condition is, of course, most famously exemplified by US President Donald Trump's popularization of the term fake news, deployed to cast doubt on legitimate news, and Councillor President Kellyanne Conway's claim to alternative facts to defend false statements made by Press Secretary Sean Spicer about attendance numbers at Trump's inauguration. The novel's depiction of a post-truth landscape provides a new angle on the tension between individualism and conformity. And through that, misinformation paradoxically breeds conformity, even as it fractures any notion of universally agreed truth. The novel's treatment of misinformation gestures towards the notion that in our contemporary moment, algorithms shape what we are conscious of. To this end, they create a dream world of the type defined by Walter Benjamin in the Arcade project back in 1982. In a Benjaminian sense, dreams are not products of a sleeping mind, but rather are the experience of moving through modern cities with their overwhelming abundance of sensual data, through which a particular way of life is subconsciously absorbed and reinforced. The online dream world sees this effect transferred to digital spaces, encapsulating an accumulation of pervasive digital technology, which covertly disseminates values and ideologies that are embedded within the technology itself. To say that algorithms can shape consciousness is to acknowledge how they can codify values and ideologies. Vol's critique, which draws a parallel between its virtual bit world and digital culture, opens up how technology can thus codify ideas in both virtual and real spaces. So Vol obviously takes science fiction as its key genre, and in doing so, it opens up concerns in a similar way to many of the other texts that I've highlighted above. Barker's HAPPY is probably a key one. Um, it takes contemporary concerns and projects them into an imagined future. And for Philip K. Dick, this is the remit of science fiction, which he argues imagines a society that does not in fact exist, but is predicated on our own society. That is, our known society acts as a jumping off point for it. This is the essence of science fiction, the conceptual dislocation within the society so that as a result, a new society is generated in the author's mind. It occurs as a compulsive shock in the reader's mind, the shock of disrecognition. For Dick, then, science fiction thus has a political function in how it disrupts social structures. Like much of Dick's work, Fall projects forward, taking contemporary concerns and following them to an imagined conclusion in a way which reveals how digital culture can reshape subjective experience. It opens in the present day and gradually progresses several decades into the future through temporal narrative leaps. It is a complex and ambitious project broken into 14 parts, which reveal a society progressively reshaped by advances in the technology laid out in the opening sections. Over the course of the novel, more and more space is given to the virtual bit world, with the novel crossing genre boundaries from a techno thriller to science fiction to fantasy. Through this, Stevenson enacts a series of conceptual dislocations, which reveal the stakes of a society continually reshaped by intensified data fiction and a growing ubiquity of technologically mediated information. Stevenson has himself acknowledged the potential for science fiction to shape technological innovation. In 2015, he contributed to the anthology Hieroglyph Stories and Visions for a Better Future, which he explains was put together with the hope that it would present some plausible innovations that a young engineer or scientist who was just starting a career could look at and say, you know what? If I start working on this thing today, then by the time I retire, maybe it will actually exist. Stevenson reveals a more complex understanding of science fiction than it as a purely disruptive genre, as was suggested by Dick. In his optimistic view that technology can improve life and that fiction can help drive positive technological innovation. While science fiction can act as a tool to critique social structures, it can also celebrate the transformative potential of science and technology. Science fiction novels thus sit on a spectrum between dystopian and celebratory accounts. As such, Stevenson is perhaps one of those authors who's most conscious of how fiction can speak to a tech literate reader and encourage them to think more deeply about about any technology they develop and how it may shape human experience, bringing the flaws of contemporary digital culture to light in a way which encourages some form of reform. However, despite Stevenson's digital optimism, there is a criticism of technology in his fiction which is starkly clear in Fall. Stevenson explains that the novel emerged from a pretty dark view of the current state of the internet. He says that he saw someone recently describe social media in its current state as a doomsday machine, and he thinks that's not far off. The novel's two titles by themselves indicate the extent to which he is critical of digital culture in its current form, in their respective allusion to John Milton's Paradise Lost and the direct reference to hell. Stevenson's critique, coupled with his hands-on passion for new technology, is one of the clearest calls for reform, identifying specific issues of the technical systems themselves in the hope that he may influence genuine change. But the depth of Stevenson's involvement with new technology and connection to key figures within Silicon Valley is not quite assuaged by this criticism. The author thus poses somewhat of a problematic figure in his simultaneous complicity with and critique of digital culture. Right. Okay, so I'm going to focus in then on how Stevenson critiques one particular set of algorithms. How he really thematizes machine learning in a way that kind of gestures towards its limitations. So the technical limitations of algorithms is explored in the latter half of the novel as a digital process modeled on Dodge's brain is activated. In some ways, Stevenson's depiction of this is influenced by David Deutsch's The Fabric of Reality, which he acknowledges Fall as owing an intellectual debt to. Deutsch's work sets out to construct a theory of everything, which draws from quantum physics, epistemology, computer science, and evolutionary theory to offer a framework which seeks to provide broader understanding of the universe. The debt Stevenson's novel most owes to Deutsch is the fabric of reality's exploration of virtual reality, in which he considers the activation of a human brain in an online world. The novel takes a step into high concept science fiction here, with the technology on display less easily relatable to that of the present day, so that its value subsequently emerges as more of a metaphorical depiction of how the technical behavior of algorithms reshapes consciousness. Stevenson's confident approach to fictionalizing technical concepts shines through here as he draws on a complex computer science concept to emphasize how algorithms are reshaping the subject's experience, deftly managing technical concepts so they speak equally to both general and knowledgeable audiences. In Fall, the key to digitizing the human brain is the connectome, the pattern of connections among the neurons of the brain. Describing the brain in these terms reduces it to a network not dissimilar from an interstate network, albeit on a vastly more complex scale. The digitization procedure involves scanning the neurons and connections between them and creating a data structure from this. It is this network of nodes and connections which is quote unquote activated midway through the novel as a disembodied process without memories or coherent thoughts. Stevenson focuses on the process and draws a disturbing depiction of a brain which lacks any knowledge of its surroundings, learning from associative memory. Upon activation, the process senses a virtual space of visual and auditory static which surrounds it. It repeatedly cycles between reaching out and sensing the static until it gradually becomes aware of the repetition. We're told the third or the 75th or the millionth time it came and went, he had a vague awareness that it had happened before. And this results in a developing self-consciousness as he now recognized in his own being a pattern of response. As it continues to reach out into its surroundings, it builds up recognizable thought processes, which are built up over time as its thoughtways began to follow creases, grooves, canyons, deepening them, reinforcing them with each trip along the same path. Stevenson's awareness of the potential to alienate a general audience leads to a deft handling of technical concepts, describing them in a way which is easy to grasp, while gesturing to the more complex ideas underpinning them, in a way which rings true for knowledgeable readers. For general audience, presents a Shelleyan horror as a digital brain is turned on for the first time and gradually learns to think. But at the same time, it speaks to a tech literate reader by fictionalizing and personifying actual algorithmic behaviors. In particular, this section draws on how neural networks function as the process learns to exist in this disembodied state. As the name suggests, neural networks are systems inspired by the neurological processes of biological brain, therefore providing an apt model for Stevenson to consider the behaviors of a digitized brain. A neural network contains a number of artificial neurons, which can transmit signals between each other, like synapses of the brain. And what distinguishes neural networks from the majority of programs is that they have not been programmed to follow a series of steps, but instead learn to complete tasks through trial and error and by considering examples, generally without being given any rules. The lack of memories or coherent thoughts as the Dodge process is activated therefore reflects the initial state of a neural network. A neural network's learning process is based on repetition as the network tries out paths and learns as a result. The Dodge process undertakes a similar iterative process until it begins to achieve progress. By the time it begins tracing creases, grooves, canyons, it is in the full flow of neuroevolution as the neural network generates and learns parameters, topology, and rules. Whether or not a reader is able to recognize the correlation between the Dodge process and a neural network, the effect is the same. The process's awakening is grotesque and alien. But by clearly couching its awakening in the behaviors of a neural network, Stevenson ensures that the uncanniness is not lost on a tech literate audience who can see how it relates to actual technology. Through the figuration of the new connections that the Dodge process forms as creases, grooves, canyons, the novel correlates the abstract connections between those with physical indentations, thereby giving the neural network a spatiality. For Deutsch, the brain requires an environment to navigate through, even a virtual one. In lieu of an environment external to himself, Dodge begins to create a digital one. He begins by producing leaves, developing them into larger structures of branches and trees. This process, as Dodge begins to create a virtual world, once again reflects the iterative procedural behavior of a neural network. Stevenson thus puts complex concepts into a physical context, opening them up for casual and tech literate readers alike. The tree too points to a computerized network, with the basic structure of the tree lending itself to the common tree data structure, where branches form the connections and leaves the nodes. But what is notable about Stevenson's approach is the complex structure and functionality of neural networks, technology which obviously underpins some of the most disruptive AI technology at the current moment, in contrast to the data structures and algorithms that have been touched on previously. By drawing on a notably complex algorithm, Fall more effectively conveys the message to a more tech literate reader who is likely to be aware of the complexities of neural networks. It thus encourages them to consider the synecdochic relationship between even the most complex algorithms and the world, and continue to think about how even these computational models can be improved. But while the novel reveals the shortcomings of algorithms, it does not suggest what new algorithms may be written to address these. As such, Stevenson's novel seems to be operating with the same ethos as Wendy Liu's memoirs on Silicon Valley, in which she describes how the purpose was to conjure a world that we can't even imagine because we're trapped in our current dead end. Stevenson concedes the limits of his imagination by simply gesturing towards a transformative implementation of technology. Rather than exploring the systems of potential positive implementation, Fall opens up the flaws in existing systems. And in doing so, it takes only the first of many steps towards conjuring a better world, albeit a world which escapes the author's imagination. The focus on a specific algorithm is coupled with a suggestion that the logical language of algorithms is a key contributor to their reductiveness. The chapter's opening line informs us that, quote, what came next could not, of course, be described without using words. An environment is thus not the only notable thing that the Dodge process is missing when it is activated. It lacks language too, and as it learns, it creates both in tandem. As it crafts places and objects, it gives them simple names. Dodge's palace is called palace, his garden garden, the town town, and so on. There's a sense that words and the objects they describe are thus inseparable, and a strong contrast between the names of the Dodge process assigns objects in Bitworld and the words coined by the human Dodge early in the novel is crafted. In the opening chapters of the novel, we learn that Dodge has given his friend Corvallis the nickname C++, and he calls the internet the miasma. There's a creativity in this which is missing from the process's world, and this creativity has an enriching effect on the world as other characters use Dodge's nicknames long after his death. The disjuncture between these two naming practices touches on the distinction between human and computer languages. With the nicknames Dodge gives to people and things, gesturing towards a pluralism of human language as celebrated by Ludwig Wittgenstein. In contrast, the language used by the Dodge process is much closer to the logical language defined in Wittgenstein's earlier work, in which he describes the limits of his language being the limits of his world. Bitworld thus literalizes a direct connection between language and the world, and in doing so reveals such a formula to be bland and inherently antagonistic to creativity. In its bland representation of Bitworld, which eventually becomes the predominant setting of the latter half of the novel, Fall opens up the limitations of computer language in offering full representations of the world. As such, Stevenson once again rehearses an argument that um, that computer language is inherently reductive. But taken in conjunction with the novel's depiction of neural networks, Fall speaks more clearly to software engineers to make them aware of the limitations of languages they are programming in. While there is room for more complex computational models to be constructed, these algorithms will always be limited by the logical nature of programming languages. The implication of these limitations of the subject is developed through a pastiche of the Tower of Babel story, which is why I've got Babel on the screen at the moment. As the population of Bitworld grows, a number of the inhabitants from town begin the construction of a tower higher than Dodge's palace. Assuming the role of creator, Dodge obliterates the tower and, as in the biblical story, scatters the people with the order that they should not speak in the same tongue, but clump according to their manner of talking. In the biblical version of the story, the destruction of the tower can be interpreted as a failed attempt for individuals to overcome the limitations placed upon them, as God orders them not to build a tower that will reach heaven and subsequently punishes them for issuing this restriction. Reading the story through the lens of Wittgenstein, the tower can be viewed as an attempt to overcome the limitations of language. Trying to create a tower whose verticality extends beyond defined limits is analogous to trying to overcome common language, to create a language separate from agreed upon rules. The subsequent confusion as the Babelians are scattered into disparate communities can be read as a warning against private languages, as the disparate pockets of people cannot communicate with each other as their language has no common reference. Stevenson's pastiche of the Babel myth is rich and opens up two key comments on digital culture. On the one hand, it gestures towards how virtual spaces are informed, in addition to language, by narrative. This myth is one of many biblical allusions woven throughout the text, which, along with the novel's titular allusion to Milton, gesture towards the importance of literary narrative in informing the world around us. The Dodge's incorporation of these narratives in Bitworld tends towards a conservative and reductive interpretation of them, speaks to a need for complex narratives within both actual and virtual spaces to enable a concordant complex subjectivity. But on the other hand, the Tower of Babel myth subverts the above Wittgensteinian reading to turn it into a parable about logic-based language rather than private language. As we've seen, Dodge's language is not simply rooted in the world, but it is the world, a flattened, one-dimensional one. While language allows Dodge to shape the world, the novel repeatedly shows him as having difficulty communicating with other processes who, quote, had developed the art of talking beyond what Dodge, who spent all this time, had achieved. The processes that construct the tower are thus positioned as developing a communal language based on agreed upon rules and therefore distinct from the Babelians' private languages, which is emphasized in how their ability to communicate extends beyond their bodies. When they stood close together, the oars that swayed their heads would sometimes flow together and would swirl about and circulate among several souls' heads at once, as if they had combined into one. The chaos that ensues after the tower's destruction, therefore, is not so much due to people attempting to overcome the limitations of all languages written in the world, as in the Babylonians' case, but an attempt simply to overcome the limitations of a monosemantic computer language. As the Dodge process is the one whose language has defined Bitworld, other processes are limited to its perspective. Stevenson's trick then is to take the Babel myth and turn it into a parable for how subjects are restricted within the online dream world. As the creator of the virtual world, the Dodge process acts as a developer, whereas the other connectome processes are the subjects interacting with the system. The novel thus elevates the role of the developer and opens up how the code they write has a direct effect on reshaping subjects. In doing so, the novel makes a direct call to encourage its tech literate audience to be conscious of how they may restrict others by creating reductive platforms, and as such should try to minimize the impact of algorithms' inherent reductiveness. But as always, Stevenson stops short of describing what such a system might look like. Once again, the author appears to be conceding limitations of his own imagination. Instead, the novel retains an optimism that technology can be transformative despite its inherent limitations. It thus gestures towards a better world and asks the reader to carve the path that will take us there. And that's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. Um, I think we might open the this event for questions from people in the audience, online and offline. So, um, yeah, there is a question from Annalena. Um, if you could repeat the second novel you mentioned when giving more recent examples of novels dealing with digital culture, such as Patricia Lockwood's No One is Talking About This.
Yeah, so there was Patricia Lockwood's No One is Talking About This and AI 2041.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, do we have any questions regarding the talk? Okay, then I will begin the discussion because I have tons of questions to you, Jamie. My first question refers to kind of a brief comment to you regarding you know the state of the digital culture as presented or represented in the literature of your choice, and the latest events that we are witnessing. Basically the AI, um, and how because my thinking is that we are past digital culture in the sense that it's you mentioned the ubiquity. Now we're talking about AI, and it's and its role in transforming not only the work but also human connection. So would you how would you describe the literature as sort of addressing these transformational changes in the relationship between the society and culture and the AI technology?
Yeah, I suppose with where a lot of these texts are beginning, it's kind of looking at how a lot of the technology that exists around us has, like this curatorial function.
Yeah,
And you start seeing that with, search engines. You start seeing that with continuing them with social media, and that's where we are with AI. AI is really it's curatorial in that sense of kind of taking that body of data that we can't really engage with. It's kind of inconceivable for us to kind of look at and process all of that data by ourselves and kind of having something produce something for us that we can't actually manage
yeah,
within it. And it's kind of just the fiction itself kind of playing that role of, where does literature fit in with that there?
hmm
Whenever we have algorithms curating stuff for us, what's the role of an author then? How does the author function as a curator in describing our world and taking and producing some sort of counter narrative to the narratives of these algorithms that they kind of produce? Um, AI seems very much like just an extension of that. It's continuing its acceleration of that
yeah,
kind of same curatorial function, that same type of function where these algorithms are kind of being given the role of creating narrative for us. Um, and very much, I think that there is that kind of more of an intensification with these novels, with fiction in general, to just try to kind of produce a counter narrative within things. It's one of those things that that they kind of present themselves like they're trying to resist, that narrative being lost in many ways, but they're also very aware of the limits of that resistance.
hmm
Um, yeah, Michel Foucault talks about like counterconduct as being like the most appropriate way to think about the subject's ability to resist power. That kind of idea that there are ways that the system allows you to push it back against it. They are not ways that are oppositional to the system. They're ways that are actually immanent with the system. And I think that more and more that there is this kind of counter-conducive nature with fiction, where fiction's kind of aware of these limitations and it's just trying to find modes of expression, modes of thinking about ways that we can be human and live rich lives, even whenever, all these tasks are kind of being offloaded from us, when we're giving so much of ourselves to this technology. And it's really just kind of asking, okay, well, how do we still remain human? How can we still enjoy being human within that?
yeah, yeah. Thank you very much. If I may, I have just because no, the literature of you mentioned, especially the Neil Stevenson. I think is a very good example of how literature, is not only just aware but critical of the technology's impact on society and culture. But at the same time, you mentioned this yourself that this literature is read by the quote unquote tech bros who really exploit the ideas within those novels to create new products. Uh, how how do you think about that? About this ambiguity of the literature itself being critical, but at the same time being sort of hijacked by the Silicon Valley engineers.
Yeah, I suppose it's kind of, and it's why I think Stevenson's a good example because, the message is quite clear in his text. I suppose it is really, it's kind of, I guess that subtlety is lost on a lot of people at times, or the point of critique. Like there is that element where obviously a lot of people read Snow Crash and they think this is kind of cool without seeing the dystopian side of things. I think the big problem with a lot of the tech bros in Silicon Valley is they read Snow Crash, they loved it, but they also read Ayn Rand. And, kind of a lot of those ideas kind of stuck with them too, in terms of,
Yeah.
putting themselves first and kind of reaping the rewards of it. Um, so yeah, there really is that tension. And I don't think Stevenson's not writing, for Elon Musk. He's writing more for, I think, those kind of fresh college graduates with
Yeah.
their bachelor's in computer science, just to try to encourage them to think, about their role within the system, to kind of think about their issues. I talk about Wendy Luce in there in her memoir on Silicon Valley, and I think that's a really interesting memoir because it talks about, her kind of going out and like working for various startups, doing an internship for Google and all, and kind of that she began reading while she was doing that work, and she began reading a lot of like David Foster Wallace, and it began to encourage her to see, her role in this system and kind of see that, there was more to the system than just, its capitalist function in, making lots of money, that it was actually shaping people's lives and affecting people on a deeper level. And really, encouraged her to kind of, rethink that there and kind of talk to people about, pushing against that.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think,
because
that's what these texts are really, that's what their potential is, to kind of speak to that type of person.
hmm Yeah, yeah. I mean, just kind of because on the one hand, I'm just thinking of how uh, um, for I think the obvious example is how also the Tolkien's literature is being exploited by the tech bros, right? I'm just thinking of Palantir and Andolier as the source of inspiration, and I don't think Tolkien will be very happy about how his legacy is being used today. But coming back to what you're saying, I think this is the one of the recurring theme, right? Is this the friction between this techno utopianism, techno positivism? I think it's well represented in the examples of the fiction you quoted, and that's so the friction between the positive and utopian ideas, where versus the dystopian and let's say negativist strands in creating technology that can in its utopian version sort of lift the humanity, but at the same time though that there is this always this sort of the dark side of the moon that sort of can sort of be the kind of lead it can lead to darker consequences as well. And so my question is like if these novels, in any case, Stevenson or maybe anything else that comes to your mind, sort of tries to represent the failure of sort of or oversights of the consequences of the technology being constructed is the sort of narrow or kind of myopic view of the technology as just actually benefiting the few. Um, how is that idea explored in some of the novels that's sort of you looked into?
Yeah, I think that one thing that you find is a lot of the novels kind of that they're very negative. They're not very. I suppose there is kind of that tension between, like whenever people are critiquing digital culture, whenever they're critiquing technology, they either, fall into that kind of celebratory account of, this
Yeah.
technology is great, it's leading some sort of progress, or they fall into that kind of overtly dystopian viewpoint of the technology, this kind of um, idea that that this technology is just bad and it's completely restricting us. It's kind of completely restricting our ability to be humans, or it's taking away our freedoms in some kind of way. And I find it's really interesting that most of the texts just kind of assume that dystopian mode. They're really interested in the flaws of technology. There's very little in terms of like the celebratory side of it.
Mm.
Um, and I suppose it's kind of interesting for someone like Stevenson to kind of that he's even falling in that direction, to really look at the dystopian aspect of it. That fall isn't a particularly celebratory. work. It does, yes, it's quite optimistic in its conclusion. I do think it's one of the flaws in most of the texts. They all end in like this kind of moment of optimism. And that moment of optimism doesn't always line up with the what's gone before. It doesn't always line up with the dystopic vision. It doesn't line up with how restrictive they've shown the technology has been quite often. And it does seem to be kind of one of those limitations of the text where they're just kind of like saying, well, things will work out okay in the end, but we don't know how.
Hmm.
We're going to get there. I kind of wonder if that's a marketability thing as well, though, that people just don't want to read fiction that's going to be a complete downer, that they always want some sort of positive message at the end. But yeah, it is interesting how if there's a spectrum between dystopian and celebratory representations, they are all on the dystopian end of it.
Mm, I see. Okay. Matilda, you have a question for Jamie.
It's a question of what if kind of questions. So, yeah, whatever. I was wondering if maybe after this boom of literature reactive to technological progress, advancements, like, and not only literature, but also movies in general. So the cultural representation of this technological advancement in fiction in a way. After this boom, will we see more of a curated presentation of technological advancements? For example, right now we are watching this Artemis 2 operation happening in real life, and I feel like it's very curated for public consumption. We see a lot of content meant to be digestible, and I'm wondering if maybe that's a result of this era where we had so much like Steve Jobs movie, the social network, that kind of well, culture reaction to technological advancements. So the question is, will the companies and organizations present their advancements in more curated, digestible way, and maybe will that be a result of being scared of being perceived like later in literature in a certain way? I'm not sure if I'm
No,
pressing.
absolutely. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, Matilda. I could definitely see it going that way. I think in terms of, and it's maybe there's just going to be more and more of a division in terms of, that type of those cultural products that have that air of being created by sole authors, and I suppose that much of my work, it looks at fiction, and fiction's always characterized by that idea that it's not a sole author, like that's a fiction in itself, that idea that any work of fiction is going to have editors working on it, there's many people inputting on it. But at the same time, there is still that kind of element that it's, a single author and that they're kind of able to communicate, their sole vision in a particular way, and that allows them to be kind of radical in their critique, allows them to be critical. But I think you're right. I think that kind of for those more like for films or video games, something that requires an awful lot of input from people, things that require a lot of money to create, there probably is going to be that element where like the message is more curated, that there is kind of more people trying to keep a hold of a particular narrative in some way of trying to present themselves in particular ways. Because you do see that already. Not necessarily with like the technology side of things, but like that idea that a lot of those biopics that are being created about musicians and things, that the families or the musicians themselves have such input that they're all trying to present, certain ways and present themselves in certain ways that kind of um, suppresses other alternative. I'm thinking about Prince at the moment. I know there's a whole thing that Prince were meant to be making a documentary, or sorry, Netflix was meant to be making a documentary on Prince, and then it was the family kind of pushed back against it, and now they're like producing a proper biopic, which gives the family's preferred narrative. And I could see that kind of emerging with technology as well, where those companies kind of present their more preferred narrative over anything else.
Thank you so much.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
And one more question, perhaps last question, I'm afraid, from Annalena.
Oh, I do not need to take away the last question. If there's someone else who wants to speak up, then I could
think
step
you're
back.
good, Annalena. Just go ahead with the question.
Okay, thanks. So I was wondering, as I see it in more recent contemporary literature, especially in the case of research, print fiction that engages with digital culture, there's also a tendency to kind of sidestep explicitly celebratory or overtly critical positions to or on digital media, and instead many texts present digital technologies also as thoroughly woven into everyday life, for example, as a story background, so that they appear ordinary or even barely noticeable. So this would be very close to what Sarah did in terms of digital banal, condition in which we no longer kind of register the effective and political novelty of our entanglement with digital media. And I'm interested in whether you have encountered these tendencies in the novels that you looked at, rather than foregrounding positive or negative stances towards digital culture, primarily depicting a state of habituation to these developments. And the question behind this would be if I'm wondering if there is a threshold publication date wise to where this positive versus negative or banal stance towards digital technologies and that depiction in literature has changed. So that if we could say, like, publication date wise, the works that were early dealing with these kind of technologies, for example, early 2000s, rather engage in a positive, negative way, either or, with the digital culture, and afterwards the habituation kind of kicked in, and then the stances or the perspective changes. And I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Absolutely, absolutely, Emily. That's a great question. Yeah, it's kind of one of those things that, when you read a lot of contemporary fiction, you see that like technology is there because it's part of our everyday life. That and I find that, especially you read certain authors like Sally Rooney, Sally Rooney, obviously her focus is on people's relationships. But technology is everywhere in her works, and she talks about like dating apps all the time. She talks about, people have their smartphones constantly with them. And that's just like, if you're just going to write a realist novel, now set in the present moment, you're going to be talking about technology because it is such a embedded part of our life. We wear technology, we have devices around us constantly, and it's how we interact with people. It's changed, it's changed how we do lectures. That there is that element of technology that's constantly going to be existing. Um, I think that you're always going to find people who are choosing technology as their subject matter, though, but it is a more limited corpus. I mean, that was the thing, was whenever I was identifying the texts for this project, it was really trying to separate out, well, who's actually writing about the technology and who's just kind of writing a realist novel about this moment that's maybe focused on something else. And it was actually quite hard to find a lot of texts that really engaged with it. It's funny, since I finished the project, there's been a lot more emerging, and it seems to be accelerating that element. But yeah, they are still in the minimum, those texts that kind of really want to engage with and take the technology as their subject matter. Um, I think that in terms of like that more banal or that more just everyday depiction of technology, like from the 2010s, like you see that, and it's something it's constantly accelerating after that. It really is that there. I'd almost want to say it's like, really, from I guess like 5 years plus from the iPhone, that's kind of really, I think, where people just kind of really see it's technology becoming ubiquitous because that's kind of people's where it becomes ubiquitous for them is whenever you have smartphones. In the 2010s, when kind of it's just the standard for everyone to have a smartphone, that's where we start interacting with technology everywhere. And that's where like it becomes mainstream to interact with technology everywhere. And I think that's when you start seeing much more represented and just consistently represented within fiction.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Just to follow up on this question, because this is really fascinating. Jamie, how about, because we talk about kind of thematic concerns of the novels. What about the form, the structure? Is any of those novels sort of representing the digital culture in its form, in its structure, not just the theme?
Several of them do. So Nickel Barker's HAPPY is very interesting in its structure. It's written in very short sections, first of all, which I think kind of it feels like Barker was kind of taking that feeling of like browsing a social media feed, within, and you see that an awful lot. Patricia Lockwood's book is like that too. Um, Weather by Jenny Awful as another example from that there, where they kind of have that almost like, you're scrolling through X, type of feel for it, where you've got these very, very short sections and jumping between things. What separates out Barker's HAPPY is it also uses color within its text, so there's that kind of sense of almost like gradients in terms of data visualization. The way she uses color, that certain words are colorized blue if they're, more appealing words, and then words that are stronger and kind of deviate from social norms are presented in red. So there's just kind of like this gradient of what's acceptable within her society. Um, so it's interesting that they're again kind of taking that particular structure for it. So there are definitely those kind of attempts to, yeah, to kind of represent in that way.
Right. Thank you, Jamie, for this for the fascinating talk and thought provoking talk. Um, I think we must end now because we're running out of time. So thank you, everyone present in the classroom and on Zoom. Jamie, thanks again for giving this talk. You have the best weekend. All of you, bye bye. Take care.
Thank you very much, Bart. Thank you for inviting me. I really did enjoy this. Thank you for
Thank
everyone
you.
for coming. Really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Take care.
Bye. Bye for now.